Welcome back to the Foundation in C# course. We're currently in Module 7, and this lesson we're going to be covering ASP.NET Core Razor Pages. So this will definitely be a departure from what we've been doing on the desktop, because now we're going to the web and looking at some web projects. So let's go right to Visual Studio and start a new project. And right now my filter's on C# Windows Desktop. Let's clear that. Let's set it for C#, but we're going to go to the web. And now we have a few options. We have ASP.NET Core Web Applications, a Blazor application, gRPC, and there's a whole bunch of other ones, including the .NET Framework Web Application. We're not going to do a .NET Framework Web Application. We're going to do a .NET Core or an ASP.NET Core Web Application. So that's the choice we're going to make. And for this, we're going to call this the Razor Message Wall and Razor Message Wall app. You'll hit Create. But with .NET Core, there's another step to take, and that's this step right here, where we have more configuration options. So right now, we have selected .NET Core. That's what you want. And you want an ASP.NET Core 3.0. That's the version of ASP.NET Core you want to select. And down below we have a number of different options. We have empty project, we have an API project, we have a web application and a web application model view controller, among others. So for our project, we're going to choose to go with an ASP.NET Web Application, which if you notice, it says in the comments or in the description, Razor Pages Content. So that's a web application. This web application model view controller is an MVC project. You've probably heard about MVC. You may not have heard about Razor Pages. This is the newer way Microsoft has designed for us to build web applications. We're going to look at both Razor Pages and MVC. And while they're pretty close, they have some definite differences. So we're going to have that comparison. But for right now, we're going to look at probably the preferred way of doing web development, especially since this is a little easier to do than MVC. And yet it has the same power, and you don't lose any of the testability or other nice features of the ASP.NET Core web applications that have that disconnected or loosely coupled architecture. So, Razor Pages, which is the web application, .NET Core, .NET Core 3. Over here on the right, we can choose to have authentication. So a web page can have a number of different ways of authenticating. Let's look at what the options are. There's no authentication, which is the default. Then there's individual user accounts, which this is for if you want to allow users to sign up and create a new account with your application. So you put this on the web, probably you'll be using individual user accounts for your authentication. That can also mean using an OAuth type authentication with things like Twitter or Facebook being the login provider, and then you just safely get the information about the user. So you don't even have usernames and passwords in your database. You just have authorizations from Twitter or Facebook or Microsoft or Google. Work or school account. So this is if you have an Office 365 or an Azure Active Directory or even an Active Directory probably in the cloud, and you have to look up the domain and wire up to it, including having some of this stuff. We're not going to cover work or school account authentication. And the reason why is because you have to have one of these things to even try it out. So we're not going to do that. And we're also not going to cover Windows authentication, because that requires you to have your own domain controller on your network. But essentially it works in a similar manner where it allows you to authenticate, but you can do single sign-on. So when you log into your computer, you can also be logged into your web application as you. So those are the options. We're going to choose no authentication to start. I will show you authentication as we go. The other options here are configure for HTTPS. This is a pretty important checkbox. It used to be that with web applications, especially back when we had .NET Framework web applications as our only web application, the HTTPS was a somewhat complicated story. And so you develop your website with HTTP, and then at some point you'd try to tack on HTTPS and answer things like, what happens if they go to my website on the unsecured HTTP? How do I redirect them to HTTPS? And do I say they can't go at all to HTTP? And those kind of questions. Well, now with ASP.NET Core, Microsoft has said, we understand those pain points. We've fixed them. And so now with this checkbox, it says, we're going to configure our application not only to have HTTPS, but to use that as the primary and only way to get to our site. So if you go to our site with an unsecured URL, it will immediately redirect you to the secured URL and will require that you use that. So it's baked right in. It's simple. It really is just that checkbox. So definitely keep that checked. The final one, which we're not going to cover in this course at all, but it is something I have covered in other courses and something that may be of value to you at some point. And that is enable Docker support. And again, this is one of those things where it used to be a pain point and now it is pretty much a checkbox and you're up and running. Docker support allows you to package your application, your web application, into something a little smaller than a virtual machine. If you're familiar with virtual machines, it's a similar concept, only it has less overhead. Okay, that's probably the simplest way of explaining it. But essentially, it's a little image that you create with your application built in. That's read-only. And so that when you work on your image locally, you create what's called a container for it. So you can write to the container. But when you're working on that, it will work the same way on your machine as it does in production because it's identical. Because that's a big pain point that especially software developers have, is they do something and it works on their machine, but they go to deploy it and it doesn't work on that machine. And we have to figure out, okay, well, there's a different setting on that machine, or this is different on that machine, or whatever it is. And so that can be a big pain point, especially when you talk about deploying, because if you deploy to production, it worked on your machine, but in production it breaks, now you have downtime. And so Docker, one of the goals is to eliminate that because you have the same experience in your development machine as you do on the big development machine that at work where everybody uses, on the staging machine, and even on the production machine. It's always the same experience. So that's definitely a great technology to look into at some point. It can be somewhat complicated, especially all the new terminology you have to learn. So take your time. Don't try and learn everything all at once. Learn C# first, and then as you have those pain points, it is just not something hard to add in later. Even if I don't check this box now, I can add in Docker support later with just a couple of clicks. So it's not like you're losing something by not checking it now. Now, just as a comparison note, we're not going to cover the .NET Framework equivalents of these different web applications. In fact, there is no real equivalent for Razor Pages. This is a newer technology. But one of the things that .NET Framework struggled with is this authentication up here. Right now, I'm choosing no authentication, but we'll add in authentication later just to see it. Well, in a .NET Framework web application, that's not really possible. It's not something you add on later for the most part. It's a painful process to do so. Instead, what you do is you have to add it up front here. And if you don't add it here, then you're in for a lot more pain and difficulty later if you try and go back and add it. So definitely some improvements in .NET Core to make our lives easier and not lock us into a decision we made 6 months or a year ago. If A year down the road, you say, we really need authentication for this web app. Not a problem. It's a couple of clicks and you'll have web authentication. Okay, so just to review, we're on web application for Razor Pages, .NET Core, .NET Core 3, no authentication, yes to HTTPS, and no to Docker support. And I hit create. What this will do is it'll scaffold out for me a sample web application, and it will try and make some decisions for me that it thinks are best. And for the most part, they are. It also gives me this starting page, which says, okay, here's more documentation. If you want documentation, here's how to publish. Here's how to get started with ASP.NET on Azure. Here's a productivity guide. There's some great stuff in here. We're going to close that down and just look at what our project is. Now, this is totally different than a desktop application. If you notice, we do have our dependencies indicator here, and that's the same as our other ASP.NET Core applications. But then we have this www root folder. And inside here, there's a bunch of folders, one for CSS, one for JS, and one for lib or lib. And then our favicon.ico. If you're not familiar with developing for the web or building websites, this is going to be a little bit of, well, it's going to be a lot of information all at once. I would encourage you to just kind of try and soak it in, because this is definitely something where there's a lot of depth here, but you can stay pretty high on the surface and not have to worry too much about things. So yes, we'll go into some depth here, but if you get a little bit lost, don't worry. Don't freak out that you have to learn CSS, HTML, JavaScript, and all these other things in order to understand Razor page applications. Now, you will have to know the basics of HTML and maybe a little bit of CSS. You don't need to know JavaScript, even though it uses JavaScript sometimes. So let's look at what the www root folder is for. When you publish a website, typically you've published to the www root folder of your web server. And so this represents what's called the static files. The files that don't change, the files that are just there to support your website. For example, the favicon, which that's this little icon right here. What that's for, it's tiny, but what this is for is in a web page on the tab, you'll see a little icon. And that's what this is. Okay, that's not going to change over time. Now you may replace it at some point, but it's not something like C# code where you're going to tweak it all the time. The CSS, this is the styling for our web page. Now CSS, all it is, this is not a language per se, it's not a programming language, let's put it that way. It is just a style language. And so what it does is it says we're going to apply certain styles to certain things. That's all it is. It's called cascading style sheets because of the fact that they cascade, meaning the more specific a rule is, that's kind of what they are as rules, the more specific it is, the more likely it is that it's going to win. Okay, so if you have 3 rules, one for the entire page, one for a section of the page, and one for a specific button, and they all have different, let's say, colors. So it said the whole page says all buttons will be blue, and the section says no, all buttons will be red, and the actual button CSS says this one's black. Then that button will be black because the most specific one won. And that's all CSS really is. Now, yes, it can get very complicated, but let's just look real quick. This is our site.css. This is our specific style sheet for our application. We have others, and I'll share those in just a minute. But this is the most specific probably we'll get. And so it says, okay, HTML, that means all of our website. I want the font size to be 14 pixels. That's pretty easy to understand. So by default, every font will be 14 pixels. And that's a very general rule. But then right down below, we have this at media, which says, look at the size of the width specifically of the web page. And if the minimum width is 768 pixels, then set the font size to be 16. So let's make it a little bit bigger, as long as you have a width of at least 768 pixels. If you have less than that, it's going to be 14 pixels. And of course, there's things in here that's going to set the font size for a more specific thing to a different size. Okay, so that's all this is. That's styling. You don't have to understand everything about this. You just have to understand the basics of these apply styles to my elements. All right, JavaScript. We have site.js, which has nothing in it. This is just documentation. But this would be for any JavaScript that you wanted to write for your application. We're not going to get into JavaScript. I would encourage you not to at first. JavaScript is a whole language unto itself. It's definitely a lot different than C# in how it operates, and it takes a lot of work to get it right. You can get it wrong really easily. It's very easy to get started in JavaScript. It's just that you probably won't be doing a great job doing so. It's not until you have a much deeper knowledge that you go, oh, that wasn't the greatest idea. And so you do it better. So I would encourage you, wait on JavaScript. Don't say, oh, I'm going to learn C# to learn web applications, so I'll have to learn CSS and HTML and JavaScript too. That's a lot more to bite off than you probably can chew at once. Learn C#. If you're going to do web applications, learn HTML and then CSS. And then if you really think you need to, add some JavaScript in and keep adding a little more. But don't go and try and learn it all at once. It's just too much, and you'll end up diluting your learning everywhere and be a lot more likely to fail. All right, the lib folder. This is where you bring in libraries to help us render our site, because HTML on its own is quite boring. Okay, it's not much more than Notepad with text in it. But if you want cool colors and you want nice layouts and you want things that might move a little bit, or those type of things, then you're going to want to use some libraries. And one of the most important libraries that ASP.NET Core uses, both in Razor Pages and in MVC, is a library called Bootstrap. And this is a whole library unto itself. And the great thing is, if you go to getbootstrap.com, the documentation there is amazing. It shows you exactly what each thing does and how to do it. So if you have a question, you go to getbootstrap.com, go to the documentation for your version of Bootstrap, which I believe we're using Bootstrap 4. Let me look real quick. Bootstrap, yep, 4.3.1 is the version we're currently using. If you go to documentation for that, it will tell you how to do whatever you want to do. So it will show you an example. And examples are great. So definitely a great call here to use Bootstrap. A lot of the web runs on Bootstrap. It used to be that jQuery was the thing that every website had, because it just made JavaScript easier. And it does. It still does. But it got overused a little bit. We're still using it, but it's not the every website needs jQuery, because of the fact that a lot of websites were using it for tiny things. Okay, sorry, sidetrack. So with Bootstrap, it's something similar where we said, you know what? It just makes web development easier and faster. And so we're going to stand on the shoulder of giants and use Bootstrap rather than trying to bake our own web framework that's just going to be a lot of work and hacky and ugly. So we'll use Bootstrap, but that's one of the libraries that's brought into our application. So that's the static content. If you had just an HTML page that you wanted to show, not a C# HTML page where you're rendering C# stuff, but just an HTML page that has nothing but HTML and CSS on it. If you had something like that, you would put it in the www root folder. All right, so that's the static content. Now let's look at the C# stuff. I'm going to skip over pages, and I'm going to go right to app settings. And this probably looks familiar because you already had app settings, I believe, at least once. But if not, this is the logging section, which just sets up basic logging. ASP.NET Core applications have logging built right into them. So if you want to do quick and easy logging, it's already there for you and ready to go. If you want to upgrade that logging to something more robust, it's just a few lines you need to tweak. And now the same logging statements you've been using still work in the new system, and it now works with your new logger. So it's again one of those things where you don't have to make the choice up front. If you decide 6 months down the road, we need a better logging system, it's still just a few lines of code, and now your existing logging will work with the new system. So that's the logging, and this is our app settings.json. This is a file that is one of our levels of configuration. And this is the clear text file, meaning anybody can read and write to it, that has access to our web server, which isn't many. It's usually an admin only. But there are other levels of settings as well. We can go up to all the way through Azure Key Vault, which is a service that Azure hosts. It's very, very cheap. And what it does is it just holds sensitive data. So if you had something like a password in here, maybe you are sending text messages and you have a username and password in order to log into that texting service so that your application can log in and send a text message. Well, you wouldn't want to put that in clear text on your machine, even though, again, probably only administrators have access to this. What you could do is you could put that same setting in Azure Key Vault and store it securely encrypted and all the rest, and then not have to worry about your password being stolen. So that's an option that you can, again, add in later or change later with very little to no effort. So that's the app settings.json file. By default, especially when you're developing and learning to develop, use the app settings.json file. If you find later you're putting sensitive information in there, then learn how to go the next steps up to more secure areas. We have program.cs. This is where the application starts. Notice public static void main. That sound familiar? That's the same public static void main we had in console applications. And that's really the same thing. It's the same interaction where when you start your web application, C# says, I'm looking for a specific starting point, specifically static void main. It's going to find that and run this. And what it does is it creates a host builder, it builds that host builder, and then it runs that host. All of that is just the way to launch your application, configure it, build it, and launch it. And it's just set up for you already. All this code is already done for you. Now this down here is yummy and green because it says they're using a lambda expression instead of curly braces. So we can just change that to use curly braces instead. And now it's happy. So just know that that's the only reason it's yelling. It's not that's a problem. It's just that my settings say, let's prefer not to use lambda expressions. But that is the configure host builder. That's the first thing that gets called. And that's where we set up things like our logging or our dependency injection. That's another thing we're using that is a pretty advanced topic, but at the same time, it's not that hard to use. Dependency injection essentially says that we don't create new instances in our code. So, if you have a class, let's just put some code up here. If you had a class called, data access. Now we don't, so it's going to yell at us, but don't worry about that. and I said data equals new data access. Well, now this main method depends on having this specific data access class available to it. That's a dependency. With dependency injection, instead of doing this instantiation here, we would pass in the data access class already created for us, and we just use it. But that way, we could pass in a different data access class, and we could use that instead. So we usually do that via interfaces. So that's a really quick overview of dependency injection. It's not something that I'm going to teach right now. It's a whole topic unto itself. But what Microsoft has done is they've built in these more advanced things into ASP.NET Core or .NET Core in general. And so we don't have to understand the depth of how to configure that. We can just use it, and it just works. And we'll see it just working in just a minute in our startup, I believe. If not, we'll see in the pages. And to configure that, it's not that hard. So if you want to add more things to your dependency injection system, it's not hard. So there's ways to do it very easily. And again, if you decide we need a better dependency injection system down the road, it's just configurations in this section right here. And then it changes the dependency injection system for your entire application. So this is the same place you add your own custom logger or do other setting changes. And again, it will affect the entire application in a way that is positive, is not a breaking change anywhere. Okay, so that's the program and the static void main. You'll come in here to configure to add, like I said, a logger or a dependency injection. Basically, anything you have to configure in your application that's different than the defaults, you'll come in here to do that in program.cs. Startup. Here's some other configuration that's more web specific. So if we scroll down here, it's pretty easy to see. First of all, add Razor pages. So they just add Razor pages to the services and say, you know what, we want to use Razor pages for this application. What do you think it takes to add MVC? Pretty much the same thing. Just say add MVC instead. Now down here, we have a check for are you in development mode? If you're in development mode, show developer exception page, meaning the page that has information about why you crashed and it has some source code and all the rest. And that's great for developing, but you wouldn't want to show that in production because they could see actual source code. So instead, if you're not in development mode, then it's going to use the exception handler, which is a /error page instead. And so the users will see a nice clean error page. Also, for production, we're going to turn on HSTS, which is HTTP Strict Transport Security. That's a pretty complicated topic, except for the fact that in .NET Core, it's just saying, yeah, use that. That's it. Remember I said before that if you went to HTTP and we wanted the site to redirect you to HTTPS, that was kind of complicated in .NET Framework. That's how you do it in .NET Core. Just say, yeah, use that. Use static files says, go ahead and allow static files to be put into this www root folder, and you can use those. Use routing. That indicates, hey, this is how you want the page to be laid out so that we can go, our www.ourdomain.com/help, and it goes to the right spot. The use authorization is here, so it allows authorization to be used, but we're not actually turning on authorization, so that's basically not being used right now. And then use endpoints for map Razor pages. And what that will do is it will look at your Razor pages routing and create the correct endpoints for you. So we'll see what those Razor pages are and how they work in just a minute. But this is a kind of a companion to program.cs with some more configuration for your site. All right, so a lot of theory here. Before we get into pages, let's do this. Let's run the application and see what it looks like. I've got a choice here of either running IIS Express or Razor Message Wall, which Razor Message Wall is the name of my project. That's because what it'll do is it will launch basically a console application, and it will use that to host my web page. I'm going to go that route so you can see all the different calls that happen to our web server. Either one will work the same way. I just want to show the console app. So the first thing it's doing when I run this is actually restoring packages that it needs. Now it pulls up the console window and it's making calls to our site. Notice it's listening on port 5001 for HTTPS and port 5000 for HTTP. And we want to shut this down. We just hit Control-C to shut this window down. And now every time I make a call to my site, you'll see that hit here. For example, the 200 says that we successfully called the endpoint /index. That's the first page. And that's what loaded. And in fact, here is our page. So this is a brand new, out of the box, haven't configured anything, ASP.NET Core web application. So we can click on privacy and go to the privacy page. Nothing much here, home page. And we have a privacy policy down here, which again, we click on that, it goes back to privacy. We click here, it goes back to the home page. That's pretty much all we have right now. Okay, but that's our web application. And if we minimize this, we'll see that there's a number of calls that were made, like to /index and how fast that went. We come up here and we'll see other calls as well, like to /privacy. So every time we make a call to a web server, this is what's getting the call, and this is the information that's coming back and how fast it came back. So if you want to diagnose what's happening in your application, this is a great way of doing that because you can see the history of everything that goes on. And maybe you see, hey, that took, instead of 6 milliseconds, it took 6,000 milliseconds or 6 seconds. That's a problem. And you can see, okay, that was what happened. Or, it hit this page and had an exception and went somewhere else instead. So you can see those kind of things. It can be kind of helpful for diagnosing issues. I'm going to Control-C here to close the application, and I close it. Or you can just hit stop up here. Either one is fine. It doesn't hurt anything to hit stop. So we had our web application, and we had a couple of pages. We had the home page, and we had, or the index page, and we had the privacy page. Where were those? Well, they were in the pages folder. And we have index, and we have privacy. Now, if we look at the index page, if you're familiar with HTML, you'll know that this is not enough HTML to render a page. HTML starts off with HTML tag at the top, and then a header, and then a body, and we don't have any of those tags in this file. That's because what happens is we actually use a wrapper page and then just inject these pieces into it. So if we go to shared and look at the underscore layout page, there, that looks better. We have our doc type HTML, we have our HTML tag, we have our header, we have our body, and at the end we have our body and our HTML close. This is our actual web page. This is like the core web page, or the main web page of our application. And it may be the only full web page your entire application has. So let's break down what's in here. Well, the head is where we put things like style sheets. That's those CSS files. Notice we have a style sheet for bootstrap.css, and then we have a style sheet for site.css. Just like the more specific a rule is, the more likely it is to win, also the last rule to be applied at the same level wins. So if you have a rule in Bootstrap, which we do probably, that says, here's the font size for our entire HTML page. And maybe Bootstrap says it's 12 pixels. But remember, our site.css said that the font size was 14 pixels, I believe, if it was a small site, and if it was larger than 768 pixels, it was 16 pixels. Well, if those two rules are the same level, meaning the entire HTML page, and I believe they are, then the rule in site.css will overwrite the rule in bootstrap.css because of the fact that site.css came last. So there is an order to CSS pages. CSS pages go in the head because you want those styles to be applied before we start rendering our body. So HTML renders or draws your web page starting at the top here. And so it's going to load these files before it draws our web page. That way, you don't see this ugly website that all of a sudden, once the CSS loads, it pops up and looks cool. We're going to get the CSS in first so that when we draw our website, it looks cool from the start. Now, hopefully, you don't have enough of a speed issue where that would be a problem because you'll be waiting on your site to load. But if that were the case, we're doing it in the right order here. So down here we have our body, and our body has this thing called a header, which seems like it should be in the head, but it's not. The header is that bar at the top where we have things like the home link and the privacy link. Those are our navigation links. And then we have this thing called a container. And inside here, we say this is the main section, and we have this special little tag here called @renderBody. Now, whenever you see an @ symbol inside an HTML page in ASP.NET Core, that represents the Razor syntax. Now we're on Razor pages, that's different. Razor syntax can be used in MVC as well. Is that confusing? Absolutely, that's confusing. But the Razor syntax says, this is HTML, but you know what? I kind of want to stick some C# in here somewhere. So this is a C# method. Notice the open close parens. So I'm going to put an @ in front of it to indicate this is actually C#. And so it's going to render that's a C#, but then the Razor engine is smart enough to say, well, after that you have this tag here, that's probably HTML, not C#. And so it stops thinking this is C# anymore after this close paren, and it goes back to thinking this is HTML. And you'll see this in other places as well. Notice up here, @viewData for the title. That's going to put C# in. There's a dynamic object that has a property called title, and we're going to put the value of that right here. But then notice -Razor message wall. That's just straight up text. And so that way rendered like it was HTML, because it is. So there is that ability to mix these two together, which is what gives you the power of either Razor pages or MVC in that mixed C# and HTML environment. Now, with .NET Core, they've also added a number of custom tags to items. So this tag here is called an anchor tag, an A. That'd be a link, essentially. And we can apply a class to it, and classes typically are for CSS. So you're going to have a navbar-brand CSS rule, and it's going to say, hey, for anchor tag that this is applied to, this is what it's going to look like. So that's all HTML. But then we have ASP-area and ASP-page. These are custom to C#, but they're not C# commands. They're Razor pages commands or MVC commands. And what this is doing is saying, I want you to go to /index for our link. But that /index is not a full URL. Instead, it's going to go through the routing engine to find where that /index really is and put that HTML in place. So they've added some tags to help us do things easier. So it sits on top of the anchor tag. And we'll be using these a lot, not just on anchor tags, but on other things as well. Typically, whatever you're in right then, if you do ASP-, it should give you a list of all the possibilities. So ASP-, here's all the possibilities for an anchor tag. The host, the protocol, the route, the controller, the action, all those types of things. So you can set all the different values. If you don't know what any of those are, don't worry, we'll get to them. And if we don't get to a specific one, don't worry, you don't necessarily need it. And when you do, you can find it pretty easily by going to ASP- and finding that particular item. Okay, so this is the kind of that wrapper page, but then we have this @render body here. That's that special thing that I talked about, that C# code. It runs a method, and what this does is it says, whatever page you're on, I want you to take that page's code and stick it here. So remember I said that the index page, this is not enough HTML to render a web page? Well, that's because we're taking this code, this HTML right here, and we're sticking it right here. Now it's inside something that has a head and a body and the navigation bar and the footer and the scripts. These are JavaScript calls down here. All this stuff is now available on this index.html page. But the cool thing is I didn't have to retype all of that for each page. Think about our dry, don't repeat yourself. The idea that you'd have to recreate this entire page on another page and then make sure you get it all right. And what if you changed from a certain version of jQuery to a different one where it had a different URL? Now you have to change on every single page that you create. And a site can get very, very large with a number of pages. That could be overwhelming. Well, this way you change it once and it applies everywhere. This page is called a layout page. That's why this one's called _layout. But you can have more than one layout page. So let's say by default you want that navigation at the top and the footer at the bottom, and that's kind of cool. But for a certain subset of pages, you wanted the navigation on the left, and you didn't want a footer, and you wanted to have a few things a little bit differently. Well, you could create another page like this and use that for the layout page for certain pages. And so the render body would render those pages in the different layout. That's layout number 2. Okay, so you have that ability to have multiple if you want. In general, until you get to a large application size, I have not found that people normally use more than one layout page. They use the default and just tweak it the way they want it. Now this is also in a folder called shared, and it has an underscore to indicate that it's shared. What that means is that any page can access this layout. So it can be used on more than one page. And in fact, we use it on all of our pages right now, the index, the privacy, and the error page. So that's a shared layout page. Let's look at the index.cs HTML page, which is where we're at. This is one Razor page. And this Razor page just has, down here, just has a little bit of HTML that has a centered text, an H1, which is a header, the largest of our headers, the top level header, and it says welcome. And we have a paragraph underneath that says learn about building web applications with ASP.NET Core. And it's got a link to that. Notice the anchor tag here. So that's all this page has. If we run this again real quick, just so you can see this page compared to the actual page that gets rendered, you'll see what I mean. It's loading here. All right, so I'm going to shrink this down a little bit. Notice the footer at the bottom here. We have the header with the navigation. All that stuff is in our underscore layout page. The only thing this page has is where it says welcome and learn about building web applications. So this right here is all this index page is. Okay, so if we add to this page, which we can do, let's just say welcome students. We come up here, we can refresh this. Actually, we have to re-render it, don't we? Browser link is currently disabled. Okay, I didn't turn it on yet. So browser link, the idea is that you can enable browser link so that whenever you make a change, you can refresh the page. So I've enabled it, and now I'd have to start and stop again now that it's enabled. And that should do it. I've had some quirkiness with browser link. It doesn't always work the way I wish it would. And right now it's not even linked. But it says welcome students now. So it's at least on the refresh of the recycle, it did do the work. It maybe have to run as an IIS. I'm not positive. But the idea here is you can have more than one browser linked, and then you can refresh and all the browsers would refresh. So if you had, let's say, what it looked like in Chrome and Firefox and even Microsoft Edge, you have 3 browsers open, and then just do a refresh here, and it would refresh all those browsers so you could see the latest changes. So that's a possibility. That's a little more advanced than what we're going to get into today. But notice I did change that to welcome students. Now, when you're first developing web applications, one of the things that I find incredibly useful is just finding other pages that work the way you want them to, or work the way you want your application to, and then just copying that design over. Okay? Because you can see the web design of an application. In fact, let's run it again. And this time, we're going to look at this page design in Chrome. So I can hit F12 to bring up the tools for Chrome. And that brings up these tools. I can go to Elements. And let's shrink it out a little bit. If I click on this select an element in the page to inspect it and click on it, and then mouse over my welcome students and select, notice over here on the right, it's a little small, but over here on the right, these are the styles that have been applied to this welcome students. And notice some of them are scratched out. And that's because the cascading style sheet rules, one overrode the other. And so it says it would have applied a font size of 2.5 rem, but because display-4 was applied, that class, we're now using 3.5 rem and a font weight of 300 and a line weight of 1.2. So we can see the rules that are applied, and you can look through and go, oh, I'm not applying this H1 rule because something is overwriting it. What's overwriting it? You look up and you find, oh, that's what overwrote it. And you can even click in here and go, oh, that's the line in the file. So this file right here, bootstrap.css, you click on it for line, looks like 369. And it takes you right there and says, that's the rule that's not being applied right now. So it was scratched out. But you can go right to that CSS file. There's a lot of power here. You can even make changes. So, thanks for watching. Hit enter. And now my HTML changes. Now note that the changes here don't get reflected back into Visual Studio. But what you could do is go, yeah, that's not quite right. what I want is I want a capital W there. And so you say, there's a capital W. I think that's a lot better. And so you take those changes that you've made and you go back to Visual Studio and you paste them in, and now you have the changes you want. That may be very simple for these text changes, but what about these CSS changes? You can apply other styles to this object. For example, color. Let's make this red. Kind of cool. Nope, dark red. Indian red. Medium violet red. Orange red. I like that best. So you select that. Well, now it shows you right in here, here's how you apply a manual style to that element. You can copy that and paste it into Visual Studio and get this result. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with editing. And again, I can't cover everything about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, or even everything about Razor pages, just because there's so much to cover. I'm just introducing you to the topic and making sure you understand what they are and the basics of how they work. If you want to go deeper, I'll have other courses on that. And I hate not giving you all the context, because that's kind of my thing, is I try and give you context so you're ready for the real world. But unfortunately, if we went into the full context of everything we're covering, then what would happen is we'd be here for hundreds of hours. And while that might be great, at the same time, you need to have this course sooner rather than later. So with that, we're going to keep going on our exploration of how Razor Pages works. And the next big thing we want to talk about is, how does it know to go a /index for this page? Or /privacy for this page? Is it because of their name? And the answer is, yeah, that's part of it. But how does it know /privacy instead of /information/privacy? Well, that's because of the relation of the file to the root pages. So if you have a Razor page right underneath pages, in that same level underneath pages, so that'd be error, index, and privacy, those are just slash and their name. And the name does not include the .cs HTML. So /privacy or /index. If you wanted to have a page that was inside of, like it was your URL /, let's say info / more info. If you wanted that type of path, all you need to do is right click on pages, say add new folder, call it info, and then any Razor page inside here will have the path of /info/ and whatever you want. That's how easy routing is for Razor pages. Now let's dive into the C# side of Razor pages, because so far I've covered the HTML side. Let's look at index right here. And I kind of skipped over these first 5 lines. These are all C# lines. The first line at page just says this is a Razor page. And so that's all you're doing to declare this as a Razor page. Next is at model. This is index model. What this is declaring is what looks an awful lot like a code behind file you would see in a desktop application. So in a desktop application like WPF or WinForms, we've seen the CS file, the class file, behind our user interface. Well, there's something similar in Razor pages. In fact, if you notice, there's a little arrow next to each Razor page, and if you expand it out, there's an index.cshtml.cs file. That's what you could call a code behind file. Now, this follows the MVVM framework, the model view model framework. That seems awful complicated. The simple version of that is that this class right here supports this page. That's all it means. Okay? Yes, there's some more complexities and there's more disconnected or loosely coupled architecture here, and that's great, and it's easily testable. That's awesome. The basics are that the index.cshtml.css or CS page, which that's called index model as a class, that supports this page. And we link the two by saying the model is index model, which index model is a class. Okay, it's called index model. The next section right here just kind of shows off what if you want to have a multi-line C# section in your HTML page. And we use the @ symbol in front of curly braces. And notice how it lights them up so we know the start and the end. What that allows us to do is have one or more lines of C# in the page without it assuming we're going back to HTML. So in this case, we have view data, and it's the title. We're saying the title is home page. Now, what is this? Well, the view data is this bundle of data we send with our web page. And so we're applying this title, which this is a dynamic object, a dictionary. And so we can add pretty much anything you want into it as far as a key and a value. So the key here is title, and the value is homepage, which if you remember back on our layout page, we asked for view data, give me the title element. And what it will do is it will get that value using the key. It's just going to put homepage dash Razor message wall. That's how that works. I don't use view data a lot. I use it just a little bit, and it's typically to send information to your layout page. That's about it. So that's the C# on the actual Razor page view. Let's look at the code behind. And the code behind looks like a normal class. It inherits from page model. And it has one thing in here that you probably haven't seen yet, and this is dependency injection. So on our constructor, we're asking for an iLogger. And we're asking specifically for an iLogger that passes in index model, which I'm not going to get into that in depth, but essentially it's just using that for the name to create our logger. But what happens for our dependency injection system is whenever a page asks for an interface object like this, it creates it for us and inserts it. So that's taken care of automatically for us. That's kind of the good magic of dependency injection. Once you understand it, it's not magic as in I don't know what's going on, but it's magic as in it just works. And so instead of saying logger, log equals new logger, and making sure you have the right kind and all the rest, you just ask for it. And now we're storing this logger here so that if you wanted to write log messages, and log messages can be informational, such as I started or I stopped, or they can be error related or issue related, where we're saying, hey, you threw an exception here. I'm going to log that so you have a record of that exception being thrown. That's what loggers can do. Well, that's already baked in for us if we want to use it. And then we have this thing called onGet. Now, if you're familiar with the verbs of web, we have get and post, which are two most common verbs. And then we have put and delete and some others. OnGet means when you ask for it and you're not passing in anything, you're not posting data. So a get is a request for a page. Post is where you're sending data back from a page. It's basically read versus write, I guess is the easiest way of saying this. So onGet is saying, hey, when you ask for the index page, run this code here. Now no code is being run. It's just saying, yeah, you can run code. And that just allows you to do any setup work or other things before you display this page. So we'll put some code in there if you want to tweak something or get something from a database or something else. But for this page, it's just don't need to do anything, just show the page. Okay, so let's create a Razor page finally. I'm going to do it right in the root of pages. I'm going to create a Razor page, and we're going to call this just blank Razor page. Hit OK, and we're going to call this message wall. We could just call it wall if you wanted to. That may be a little shorter, but I think message wall is fine. Do you want to generate a page model class? Well, that's the kind of code behind type class. Yes, we definitely want that. Do you want to be a partial view? That would allow us to use this page on other pages, kind of like as a piece of the page, and reuse that more like a control than anything else. And no, we don't want to do that. Yes, you want to reference the script libraries. And do you want to use a layout page? Remember I said that the underscore layout.cs HTML is the default layout page? Well, if we don't specify a different layout page, which we could do here, it will use the underscore view start file, which is not, it seems like it's not what I told you, but it is. And I'll show you in just a minute. But this is going to use the underscore layout page as our layout page. Go ahead, add. And that's going to create our page for us. And then we're going to look at the view start page just to show you that yes, it does use underscore layout. Once this is done scaffolding up all the information it needs to, and this can take just a little bit when you're first doing it because it's restoring packages and other things from the web that it needs to build out these pages. So it's doing a little bit of just-in-time stuff. Once you do it the first time, it's faster the next time. All right, so it's create our page. Let's go back to the view start to look at that. The view start says just use layout underscore layout. So that's all it is. So that's the page we'll be using. The nice thing about this, though, is if you decided we don't want to use underscore layout for everything anymore, we want to use a different page, say layout 2, well, we wouldn't have to go and change every single file that used that layout page. We could just come in here to view start and put a 2 at the end and we're done. So again, Microsoft thinking through how are we going to change this down the road and how do we make it not painful to do so? And that's the way of doing it. Okay, let's close out everything but the message wall page, which right now just says message wall. We can put a space there. But it has the reference, says it's a page, has the reference to the model correctly, and it has the title of message wall, which can put a space here as well. So that's our page, and if we were to run this application doing nothing else, we can even look at the CS while we're doing it. There's a blank on Git, and that's it. So there's our page. There's no link for message wall. It doesn't appear magically. We have to put it in there. But until then, we can say /message wall, and that's not case sensitive. And there's our page, message wall. That's it. Okay, so this is what we're going to work with and create just our basic little form that has the, hey, leave a message, and then have a list of all the messages down below. So let's start with the user interface portion, the display. And we're not going to make the world's prettiest HTML page. That takes a little more work, and it's not something that we really need to do for this video. With that being said, we'll try not to be horrible in how it looks. So let's start off with, we're going to create a form. And a form allows you to easily post information back to your page. And so with Razor pages, all the work on this specific page is going to be posted back to this specific page. And so it's very, very small, the work you have to do. You have your get, which is kind of like your read, and you have your post, which is kind of like your write. So we have a form, and in here, let's create just a couple of items. So first we're going to have, well, just our message itself. So we're going to do a div, and a div is just kind of like a section on an HTML page, and we'll set this class equal to form group. And that indicates this is a group of items on a form. And we're going to have a, let's do a label for, actually ASP-4. And this is going to be for, we got to figure out what this label is going to be for. Well, it's going to be for our message, which we don't have that yet. And I'll show you in just a minute how to do that. So here for our message, and I think that's good. And then we'll have our input. And this input is going to have an ASP-4. And that's going to be for message again. And the type equals text. And let's have a placeholder as well. The placeholder is what we put in the input box. And it just says, please enter a message. In fact, let's just say type your message. Like so. And we should have a button too, probably. Type equals submit, and we should have a class for this of btn and btn dash. Let's go with primary and see what that looks like. Okay, now we're using this message, but it's saying, hey, I don't have a definition for message. What is that thing? Well, it's actually a property over here. So let's create a property in this, and we're going to say prop. Let's see, a string called message. And let's make this a bind property. Not properties, property. So what a bind property is it's saying that you're allowed to send information to this property when you post data. When you send data, you're allowed to give me a value for this, and I'll put it in this property. That's what it's doing. Now if you come back over here, it's not yelling at us anymore for this message here. We hit save, and we don't have a post right now. Let's create one just so we have something. So a public action result of type on post. And notice I don't have to send any information in because it will put the value into our message property. I have to return something here, so I'm going to return page. What that will do is go right back to the same page. That's all we'll do. I'm going to put a breakpoint here, and we're going to look at this message property, just get something set up, and then we'll talk through why it works and how it works. So let's run this and see what our message wall page looks like now. So /message wall. And there we go. We have a page, and it has a field in here that says type your message. I'm going to type testing. I'm going to click the submit button. And it submitted, but it didn't actually hit my post. And that's because I didn't actually do anything with it. I didn't say in my form to say a post. So your form, when you submit, has to say method equals post. Notice our verbs here, get, delete, post, and put. In general, you will use post. Now if we run this again, and we say message wall, and we type test and hit submit, it hits this breakpoint right here. And if we look at our locals for this, and we look at message, it says the value is test because we have sent it across the wire into this property through our post method. So what's happening here? Well, we have a form, and a form is a specific type of HTML section. And what it's designed to do is to send information back to the web server. And we have a button in here with a type submit, and that's a specific type of button. The system knows when you click a submit button that what you're doing is you are saying this form is done, whatever form it's in. And since the method is post, it's saying, okay, I'm going to submit this form as a post call. Now, how does it know where to post this to? It doesn't have a URL in here anywhere. Well, because we're on a Razor page, unless you specify a path, it says you must mean this same exact page. So I call the onPost method. And that will, it used to be, and with MVC it still is, that you would send your data back as a parameter. But now you don't have to, because now we have bound to this message property. And so that's this property right here, which allows binding because it's a bind property. And so we've put the value right into this property. Now you can just start using that property however you want it to. Now this is probably a good time to talk about a thing called state. And this is something that often confuses newer web developers. And that's the idea that ASP.NET Core Razor Pages by default does not have state. It is what's called a stateless web application. And what that means is it does not remember your information between calls. So every time you call the server, it is doing everything all over again. And it's learning about you for the first time every time. That's actually a good thing. It used to be with .NET Framework, we have these things called web forms. And if that sounds very familiar or very close to something else like WinForms, that's because they were designed around the same time and with a similar desire to make things easy. But web forms had the concept of state. And you could remember between calls all the information about you. So this message, we could store that between calls. Here's the problem with that. First of all, it got to the point where we were storing, some applications store 3, 4, 5 megabytes of data between calls. Now think about a web server trying to remember 5 megabytes of data per person. How many people can that web server scale to? Well, a whole lot less than if you only remembered a little bit about a person, and even less than if you didn't remember anything about the person. Because we had to remember all this information, web servers got slower and slower and could hold less and less people. This is a problem on things like Black Friday, or which in the US is a huge shopping day, or on things like the first day of college, where all these students are coming in and getting information about their courses. Or when a site hits the news and everybody's going to the site to check it out. That causes web servers to crumble and fail. We had all these problems with the difficulties trying to maintain all this session information. Then to add to that was the idea that we want to scale web applications, meaning maybe you want to have 2 different web servers both hosting your site and having this load balancing idea where if you come to the website, you may be running on server A, where if I come to it, I'm running on server B. And then we can have twice the volume because we have twice the computing power. But the problem is, if you do that and you're remembering state, you have to keep a person on one server. You can't move them somewhere else halfway through. Otherwise, their state would not go with them, or at least not easily. So there's a whole host of reasons why state can be abused and can be a bad thing. Now, it does not mean that state is inherently bad. There are ways to do state well, and Razor Pages does support the ability to be a stateful or remember state web application. So there is a way of doing it. It's just by default, it's stateless. And don't think that's a bad thing. Think that's a good thing. I would encourage you not to use state unless you absolutely are sure that's what you need. Because most likely, there's other ways of doing this. But it does make demos for people like me who are trying not to use data access. It makes demos a little harder. So we're going to do a couple of workarounds in this demo in order to see how state works or stateless works and how we can kind of store information between calls, which basically means we're going to post the information back even if we're not changing it. So with this page, we right now have just our message and the submit button. What I want to add is a way to show all of the data about the message that you posted. So let's post it right below the form. But we first need to have a list. We're going to do a really simple list of string. Prop a list of string, not even a binding list, just a list. We don't need binding lists in Razor Pages. And this is going to be a list of messages. This is the plural. I am going to make it a bind property, meaning that you can post to this. So I am going to do that. And this is kind of going to be a little bit of a workaround because I don't have a database. Because the idea would be is on post, we're going to save this message to our messages list. And let's just do that right now. So messages.add message. That's what we're going to do on post and then redirect back to this exact same page. But the issue here is that, remember, it doesn't remember state. And so if we post a message, we're going to save to it. It's going to send this class back, and so it's going to have one entry in it for a message. They're going to post a new message, it's going to have one entry in it, not two. That'll be a problem, and so we're going to allow the site to post all the messages, including the new one, every time. Just a little bit of workaround. The alternative, the quote-unquote right way of doing this, would be to have a database. And so instead of just adding to the list, we would post this to a database. And then the onGet would read from a database. And so every time we read the new list, we should have the next value in it. And that would be the way to go eventually. But for this demo, we're going to have this little bit of a workaround. So with this, what we're going to do is down here, we're going to say, let's just display this list. We're going to have this list display using a @ForEach, which you know what a for each is. I don't have a messages. Well, that's because I have a model.messages. Remember, the model is that actual class. So the form assumes that. That's why you can use message directly. So for each one of these, I'm just going to create an h3 tag. I'm going to say @item. That's it. Just loop through this list and show all of the messages. And let's maybe put above it an h1 or h2 tag that says these are the messages, like so. And we'll loop through every message. Now, if we did this right now without doing anything else, let's just demonstrate the issue with stateless, or the issue of doing it this way directly. So I have /message wall, and it goes, oops, null reference exception. Why is that? And notice this is the user-friendly, or the developer-friendly error page. It's got a whole bunch of information. It's got information about what the issue was. It even has any query data, cookie data, header data, routing data, all that information on here so that you can diagnose what the problem is. You can even view the raw exception. So that's the raw exception right there. That's the actual what you'd see in Visual Studio. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is up here, I have a list, but I'm trying to use it before I instantiate it. There we go. Now it's instantiated. Now if you realize again, it should be that we can get on with our demo. I also want to point out real quick, notice the little lock symbol right here? That means we're using HTTPS. And if I click over here, it says HTTPS. If you say, well, Tim, I don't want to do that. I want to use HTTP. Well, then what you do is you'd say port 5000, that's the HTTP port, and take out the S, and you hit enter, and it says lock again, port 5001. That's because we've turned on HTTPS redirect. So it's doing it for us. That's how silent it is. It just does it. So our users won't know anything about secured. It just will be secured. All right, so these are the messages. Let's type out testing and hit submit. Cool, we have testing up here. How about hello world? Cool, we have hello world, but no testing. That's because it forgot about testing. It didn't know about testing. It just knows what the new thing that you've added in. You didn't tell it to remember the other messages. And because we're only adding the latest message to our list, that's the only message on the list between calls. That is the issue or the thing to overcome with state. You may say, well, it's time to turn on state. No, it's not. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to post that entire list. And how do we do that? Well, let's get rid of this. We don't need a label for that. We're going to do an @for loop for i equals 0. I is less than model.messages.count. So we're going to loop through every message in the messages list. And for each one, we're going to create an input. You may say, well, Tim, we don't want to have this huge, long input list that has all our previous messages. We think we can modify all those other messages. Gotcha. No problem. Type equals hidden. And we're going to say ASP-4 equals messages at position I. So every single message one at a time. Is this efficient? Not terribly, because this is kind of a workaround for not having a database. You want a database. You want some kind of data store for your calls. But this will at least demonstrate for you how you could do it if you didn't have a database and you wanted something just for the front end. Okay? Now, with just that little tweak where we're sending back each message in a hidden input, let's run this again. So you go to message wall. And we're going to say, hello world. That's the one. Now we'll say, this is Tim. That's 2. Check that out. Goodbye. That's 3. So now we have our messages on the list. Now it may be that it feels like this page is doing something kind of dynamic and we're not getting a reload, but we really are. We're going back to the server every time we hit submit, and we're refreshing this entire page. That's what's called server-side development, meaning all the work gets done on the server. So all that C# code, the for each and all the rest, that's being done on the server, and then what happens is it builds an HTML page, just a straight up HTML page, and sends it down to the client. If we hit F12 here, let's expand this, and let's look at the goodbye Tim, or hello world. Notice it just says H3 tag. Let's zoom in here. It just says H2, H3, H3, H3. There is no for loop here. That's because the server created this web page. And so all your C# code, first of all, it's safe. If you have any important business logic in your C# code on this Razor page, you probably shouldn't, but let's just say you did. It's not going down to the client. The client never sees a line of C# code. They can't see it. They can't look at it in any way. Instead, what they see is just the completed HTML page. That's it. That's server-side development. Now, you may have heard about JavaScript and how you can create single-page applications and things like that. JavaScript is a client-side language, meaning if you want to work with JavaScript and if you have your page rendered by JavaScript, the JavaScript is viewable by this browser. So if I go to source here and go to JS, look at site, does that look familiar? That's our code comments from our site.js file. If I look at lib and let's look at jQuery dist, there's the jQuery code. Notice it's actual code, not the compiled version of something. And the reason why is because we send JavaScript all the way down the client. It's a client-side language. That's where it gets run. And so that's the difference between client-side and server-side. Server-side is what ASP.NET Core MVC and ASP.NET Core Razor pages, that's what they do. They're server-side languages. Now, they can partner with client-side languages like JavaScript or even a tool like Blazor, which is C# in the client side. So I just want to point that out, that this is a server-side language and that's where the work is being done. That's why it doesn't remember between calls. Now, the way I'm doing this right here is whenever you post data, it sends this message right here back, and it also sends these messages as well. Obviously, if you had a few hundred lines of messages, that would be a little more intense to post. But for this demo, it's fine. In general, like I said, if this submit happens, it should save to some sort of data store where it's persisted, and then you just remember how to access that data store to get back your messages. Okay? So that is the basics of how to create that Razor Wall project in ASP.NET Core Razor pages. As you can see, there's a whole lot more I could cover, and there's a whole lot more than a desktop application has. A desktop application has state. It has the idea of remembering between calls. It has an easier user interface. So instead of writing, HTML, you are just dragging and dropping, or at least seeing it visually a little easier. And so there's a lot to be said for starting in desktop development, because what you really are learning is C# code. And I've stressed it before, I'm going to stress it again. User interfaces are great, but they're just a portal to your C# code. So all of this HTML design is just there to support your C# code and what you pass back and what you pass to the site and back and display. That's all it's doing. And really, it'd be a support for data access and for your business logic. So just don't get too hung up on I have to know this in order to know C#. You can learn WinForms or Console even and learn C#. It's only when you want to add a new user interface that you might want to consider web development. Okay? Now let's look at our pro tip for today, which is that Razor pages are best used for, I hesitate to use this word, but I'm going to use it anyways, simple web applications, rather than as a backbone for single page applications. And I say I hesitate to use the word simple because I don't mean simple as in not complex. I mean simple as in easier to do. Okay? In fact, a lot of study has been done. A lot of people are coming to the conclusion that Razor pages are probably the better way to go for a complex web application. It just makes life easier because you have these little code bits supporting one page at a time. And we'll see the comparison to MVC next after we go through our mini project. But Razor pages are just easy to work with in comparison to other web applications. But if you're going to create a backbone for a single page application, which might be powered by Blazor, or it might be powered by a JavaScript framework such as Angular or React or Vue, Razor Pages probably isn't the right choice. There are other choices out there, and we'll see those. Okay? But for a web application where you say, I want this to be easy to maintain, that's where Razor Pages really shines. Okay? So that's your pro tip for today. Your homework. I tweaked the homework just a little bit because of the fact that we're not doing databases yet. So build a Razor Pages application that has a simple data entry page with first name and last name fields. And have the buttons say, hi, first name and last name. But that doesn't mean a pop-up. It just means somewhere on the page. So have it post back to that same page and say, hi, Tim Corey, when you press the button. So you're passing two properties back in a post, and you're displaying that result on the page somewhere. Go ahead and tackle that. It's pretty similar to what you already did. It's actually a little bit less complicated than what I demonstrated. And once you've tried it out a few times and maybe gotten your feet wet with Razor Page applications, move on to the next lesson where we're going to do a mini project with Razor Pages.